Our next session is going to be more law enforcement oriented, and we're very fortunate to have two people from the Attorney General's office here from Michigan, two Assistant Attorney Generals, David Chennai and Tom Clement. And just want to give you a little background on them, each of them. First, David Chennai is Division Chief of the Health Care Fraud Division, the Attorney General's office. He was appointed an Assistant Attorney General in 1996, assigned to the Criminal Division. He spent his first years with the department assigned to a financial crimes money laundering task force, which focused on the identification and dismantling of organized drug trafficking organizations. In addition to this experience, he handled a variety of public corruption cases, fraud cases, and cold case homicides. David was promoted to Criminal Division Chief in 2007 and supervised approximately 25 full-time department employees and several contract employees. In 2010, he was transferred to his current assignment as Chief of the Healthcare Fraud Division, which is the federally certified Medicaid fraud control unit for Michigan. He served on the executive committee for the National Association of Medicaid Fraud Control Units from 2012 to 2013 and presently serves on the association's finance committee. Tom Clement, also with the Attorney General's office. He currently serves as Division Chief in the Licensing and Regulation Division of the Michigan Department of Attorney General. Tom joined Attorney General Bill Schuete's office in February of 2014. The Licensing and Regulation Division is comprised of 13 attorneys and 6 support staff. Together, they represent the Michigan Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs and the various state boards in their role of regulating and formally prosecuting disciplinary health professional and occupational licensees. Tom began his professional career as an assistant prosecuting attorney in the Eaton County Prosecutor's Office in 2002. Following his time there, Tom spent approximately 10 years in private practice, primarily in the area of state and federal defense work. Tom received his law degree from Michigan State University in 2002, and while in law school, Tom was a 4th-semester member of the Moot Court Board, participating in both appellate and trial advocacy competitions. He captained the 2002 Fordham University Securities Law Team, which was awarded Best Brief and Runner-Up in Oral Advocacy. His undergraduate degree is from Western Michigan University in 1999. Tom is married to his wife, Beth, also an attorney. They have 3 children, Claire, Leo, and Camille. And without further ado, David Chennai and Tom Clement.
Thank you, Jerry. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm sure the segment everyone's been waiting for, 45 minutes with 2 government lawyers. Right after lunch, too, no less. It's a huge honor to be here and speak to you all today. It's an issue that both Tom, my colleague, and I are very professionally invested in. We want to share some of our thoughts and views with you today. I have 3 kids, just like you heard Tom does, so obviously there's a personal investment there as well. Sort of a housekeeping matter. Tom and I are here in our official capacity as assistant AGs. A bit of a disclaimer, though, that our views and comments and opinions aren't necessarily those of the AG. Give you a quick overview of what we're going to cover, and we have a lot of material to throw at you, so I'll be going kind of rapid fire, so I apologize for that. But I'm going to cover a few fast facts. We're going to talk about sort of battling the pill culture in this country via law enforcement, some of the legislative responses we've seen so far, and then some evidence of progress, which I think is really, we touched on it here today already, but I think it's really important. There is already evidence of progress on this issue. Tom's going to, for the second half of our time, talk about the state task force that Dr. Waller mentioned. He's going to talk about the Michigan automated prescription system, and also really what he does every day, and that's the regulation of medical professionals in Michigan. If we don't have time, and I think we probably won't have much time for questions in this segment, both Tom and I are going to be here for the Q&A section, so jot down questions you have along the way, because it's unlikely we're going to have time at the end of our presentation to cover that. Some fast facts regarding prescription drug abuse. This is kind of old news now, unfortunately, but the CDC has now, for many years, characterized this as an epidemic. Dr. Waller mentioned this one also, that, now unintentional injury, death, the leading cause is drug overdose, which is really extraordinary. You think about when we have loved ones that go and leave the home every day, and you say things like drive safely, and that actually is now no longer the leading cause of unintentional injury, death. More overdose deaths from pharmaceuticals than all other so-called illicit drugs combined. Last year we talked about this even more so than we have this year, but I mean the myths that are associated with prescription drugs that sort of give this aura of safety, that's a fallacy. The fact that it's true that they're made in labs and subject to very careful controls, prescribed by physicians who are well educated. We see grandma and grandpa take them. They're intended to cure illness, not create them. Some other fast facts. In last year, Michigan providers alone wrote 21 million prescriptions for controlled substances. And what's extraordinary about this is that we looked at this data from 2007 until last year. And so that's not a huge time frame there, 7 years. And what we've seen is 4 million more prescriptions written last year than in 2007. So okay, natural increase, but you think about that. Michigan's population during that same time period actually decreased a little bit, okay? So I mean, population, slight decrease, we have 4 million more prescriptions. And actually what's equally alarming, if not more, is dosage units. And this is data that's collected through the MAP system that Tom's going to talk a little bit more about. But I don't have this on a slide, but that same time period in 2007, in Michigan, there were 179 million dosage units. And then last year, so we're going from 179 million last year to 744 million. 179 to 744 in dosage units. So we're talking about millions of more prescriptions for millions of more dosage units. It's really, really extraordinary. And we're talking about all controlled, but over half of those are Schedule IIs. And then sort of another sobering, every day 44 people die in the US from prescription painkiller overdose. And it actually is much more if you include all controlled substances. Apologies to those of you who were here last year. I have a lot of new material. I had the honor of speaking here last year. This is one that I regurgitated and that Dr. Waller mentioned earlier, but it's just, I think, too compelling not to hit again, and it's part of my PowerPoint, so you're going to see it again. But seeing it visually is pretty compelling too. So here, just a reminder for those that don't know, the U.S. makes up actually less than 5% of the world population. And if you look at global opioid consumption, here the U.S. is in red, and the rest of the world is the blue slice of the pie, which is less than a quarter of that pie. And of course, the most prescribed drug, this data is from 2010. I'd be shocked if it changed a lot since then. The most prescribed drug at that time, hydrocodone. When you look at world data on hydrocodone, the U.S. in red, being less than 5% of the world population, is consuming 99% of the hydrocodone. Part of the explanation, is that hydrocodone is not available everywhere. Countries like Great Britain and Germany, it's no longer available for medical use there. And to the extent that represents a trend, maybe we'll get there in the U.S., but I have not heard any chatter about that anytime soon. So, all of this sort of points at a pill culture that we have in this country. Obviously, we're distinct from the rest of the world. And, Dr. Waller asked the question this morning, how did we get here? And the answer, which we lawyers always love to give, is it's complicated. And so I put together a few factors that I think have played into the situation where we are today. And forgive me if I guess folks in the back can look behind you, but I'll mention everything here. A couple here, we've got what I call the insurance squeeze, okay? And this is For those that think, once you get your MD or your DO, you're on easy street. I'm here to tell you, we encounter in my line of work as a healthcare fraud prosecutor, a lot of physicians who struggle to get the lifestyle and salary and compensation that they want, and that influences how they practice medicine. The insurance squeeze I mentioned here is the fact that their compensation is largely tied by corporate insurance companies or government insurance companies like Medicaid or Medicare, and insurance programs, I should say. And they impose fee screens and things like that that cap what physicians and other providers are going to make when they treat people. Employer pressure, I put that one up there. You have a lot of physicians, Dr. Waller is one of them, who works for a large health system, okay? This is a large corporation, and these corporations often impose on their providers guidelines, goals, et cetera, for the number of patients they're going to see. They'll even impose schedule templates that essentially define you're going to get this many minutes to see this patient for this need. And all that translates into less time with the patient in the room. You have sort of the natural trappings of the illness of addiction. If you've studied it and listened to people who are recovering addicts, they'll tell you about things. Lying and stealing from your own family, is unfortunately not unusual when you're in the throes of addiction. And certainly people who are addicted and not being treated are going to lie to their provider, their healthcare provider as well. And that's an issue for the providers. You have internet ratings. Dr. Waller touched on this one too. He talked about the practice of medicine not being a customer service, if you will, driven profession. And it's not. It's not a situation where the customer is always right. Prescribers have to have the courage to say no, even when it means they're going to get a bad rating on the internet. And they're not immune to being sensitive to that. None of us would be if we're out in trying to run a business. And so if you are treating a population and making them upset at you, they're going to write about it, and they're going to say things not like, Dr. Smith recognized that I am at risk and didn't fill my prescription. They're going to say, he's an uncaring idiot, or probably much worse. You've got manufacturer influence. I didn't turn around to see who asked the question, but somebody asked a question about the influence of pharmaceutical manufacturers. At any given time, there's litigation going on around the country involving alleged kickbacks. And so, pharmaceutical manufacturers are corporations. They exist to make money in large part, keep their shareholders happy, and move product. And they come up with very creative ways to do that. There are laws, obviously, against straight kickbacks, but there are very creative ways in which manufacturers of pharmaceuticals seek to influence prescribers and increase the amount of drug or product that the prescriber will write. And then you have enforcement challenges. We all like to say that law enforcement is not going to be able to solely bring a solution to this problem, and that's absolutely true, but we're a component of it. But it's tough. It's tough for us to bring criminal charges to prescribers in all but the most egregious situations. At the root of that really is the subjectivity of the practice of medicine. It's full of judgment calls, right? And so a lot of criminal cases, unless again we're talking about outrageous conduct, and I'll give you a couple examples here in a minute, it's really tough for a criminal prosecutor to get where we need to be with our proofs in front of a jury or a judge. Because it's going to be a battle of the experts, again, unless you have absurd circumstances. There will always be someone who will say that, writing this quantity of a controlled substance or not doing all the normal trappings of appropriate practice, like urinalysis and appropriate alternative therapies, weren't necessary in that case. And that's tough for us. So criminal enforcement, and I've mentioned a couple of things already, but what we try to do in my division is approach the issue from a fraud perspective, which might seem a little odd at first because, we talked about some losses already today, but the simple matter is that if a a medical provider provides services or writes a prescription when there's no medical necessity for it, doesn't matter if it's a government program like Medicare or Medicaid, or if it's Blue Cross or any other private payer, they're not going to pay for that. The insurance companies and the government programs only pay for that which is medically necessary. So if you have somebody who is prescribing a quantity of a controlled substance beyond the pale, and you have an expert who will testify that there is no medical basis for that prescription, and they were paid for it, you have fraud. And the good news for us is that even if we have no fraud in the, most physicians don't get directly compensated when a prescription is filled at the pharmacy, right? It's a separate process. The pharmacy bills Medicaid, for example, for a prescription and gets paid. And that money doesn't go directly back, unless there's something else going on, back to the doctor. We have some favorable law that allows us to charge the doctor because they know the patient's on Medicaid and they cause a false claim to Medicaid by writing a prescription, even though they don't directly benefit from that financially. In Michigan, we have some pretty tough, I'm not going to get into it today, but some pretty tough case law in state court for us to deal with the issue of drug delivery. My division, we employ about 15 or so AG investigators who are sworn police officers, and they spend a lot of their time visiting doctors' offices in an undercover capacity. And when we're investigating a doctor for overprescribing narcotics, if they walk in there and they say anything about pain, even if none of the usual and appropriate treatment mechanisms are utilized, so the doctor's not doing an adequate history, no physical exam, no urinalysis, none of that, which would probably, most physicians would be shocked by that. If our agents are talking about pain at all, we have case law that tells us that we're not going to be able to charge any kind of drug delivery in that case. And we try and cope with that as best we can and still be as effective as we can be. We have delivery causing death. We've seen that charged around the state for drug dealers who deliver drugs to another person who takes it and then dies. We've actually looked at that from a provider perspective too, a prescriber who writes and then there's a death. The issue there and why we haven't brought any successful cases there has typically been causation. So what I mean by that is, in the few cases we have examined, the victim has had other controlled substances in their system. And so you have multiple causations at work, and medical examiners are loath to conclude that maybe the Vicodin was the cause of death when in fact there may have been 2, 3, 4 other controlled substances that may have contributed to the victim's death. I mean, so why are we focused so much on providers? I mean, part of it, and the reason why my comments are basically limited to physicians and other prescribers, it's in part because of what my job duties are, and that we only address the provider angle. But I think it's really, the providers are in a unique, and I would argue the best spot to make an immediate difference on the issue. This is prescription drugs. Heroin's a different story. Prescription drugs are moved and delivered in this country through a closed system. Okay, and these are not dropped out of an airplane, in the Everglades and picked up, smuggled in on, homemade submarines. I mean, these are brought in. It's a closed system that's regulated closely by the DEA, and that gives us a lot of opportunity for control over that. And there are opportunities there that are yet unrealized, but that's in part why I focus on that as well in my comments. A couple of case examples. This is a case we just finished up, and unfortunately, I guess being here in Jackson, I have to tell you, we've now made him a member of your community here, but you're not going to see him on the street. This is Dr. John Verbofsky. I guess I shouldn't say doctor anymore because Tom's division stripped him of his medical license for life, which is a brand new statute. So he will not practice medicine again, and he's currently in prison. Dr. Verbofsky was a rather prolific writer of controlled substances, and what we were able to do with him is we got information through a confidential informant that he had a number of drug-addicted patients that he began to then coerce for sex. And it got to the point where they were no longer being seen in the clinic, they were being seen at home, and there was no medical treatment at all being provided with this. It was just women who were drug addicted, who were doing anything that they had to do to get their prescriptions. And so some other sort of favorable, strong points of Michigan law we were able to utilize here and charge Dr. Verbofsky not only with fraud, because as I said, there was no medical purpose for his prescriptions he was writing to these women, but also with criminal sexual conduct first degree, because he committed CSC during the commission of another felony, which was the fraud. So Dr. Verbofsky is now in prison. He was 67, by the way, at the time this was all going on. We just finished this case up a couple months ago. The other case, I know after us we have folks from the DEA who will be talking. This was a federal case. We didn't do this case. This is, I mentioned this one because it's sensational, but I want to emphasize that, that it sort of makes for a better story and illustrates some points, but there are a lot of other providers out there who we are addressing who don't sort of have the same shock value. But Dr. Condell on the right there was prosecuted federally and convicted. He ran a clinic in Hamtramck that was, I mean, the picture of it that I've seen online, I mean, it was no wider than the screen here. And he had chairs outside on the street because he had people lined up literally around the block. He would see apparently over 100 patients a day. And between 2011 and 2013 wrote 3.7 million dosage units of controls. Now here's the thing. This is just extraordinary to me. In April of 2012, he was the #2 prescriber of controls in Michigan. Number one was University of Michigan Health System. He was #2. Number 3 was the Henry Ford Hospital Health System. So some comments here about the legislative response, and Tom is going to talk more about this. Some things that have already happened in Michigan. Probably 5 years ago, doctor shopping behavior was criminalized. It became a crime to engage in doctor shopping behavior. Naloxone distribution was only about a year ago, and what that law did, it did a few things. Number one, it made it permissible now for doctors to prescribe naloxone to the family of addicted patients. So the term is at risk. You're able to give naloxone or write a prescription, and they can possess naloxone if you are close to an at-risk patient. And there are also some immunity protections that were in the statute if you choose to give the drug. Just this week, the legislature passed, and the governor has not yet signed, but it could happen today, for all I know, Good Samaritan protections for those that seek aid on behalf of an overdose victim. Now, this bill was, in my view, a step in the right direction, but probably did not go far enough. And what I mean by that is heroin is not included. So if you have an overdose victim and you call in aid for them, then you're immune from certain offenses, from being prosecuted for certain offenses, so long as the overdose is based upon a prescription drug overdose, not heroin, okay? The other sort of oddity, in my view, is that there is a line in the sand drawn with regard to age on this bill, and that the immunity protections, and again, this whole bill is meant to incentivize life-saving behavior, and sort of in lieu of letting go lower-level criminal offenses. There's an age line drawn in the sand there where you only can take advantage of the immunity provisions if you are, I believe it's 21 and under. So if you are 22 or older, that will not apply to you. In the future, I'll leave this to Tom because I'm running out of time. Hopefully we'll be addressing changes with the MAP system. And then, I just want to mention some evidence of progress. I think it's really important that you all understand that not only are you making a difference today, but you already have. It's not, the issue is still certainly front and center, and there's a lot more that can be done, so I'm not trying to suggest that we take our foot off the gas here at all. But if you look around now, and maybe it's just because I'm getting closer and closer to the issue, but all the time you're seeing, enhanced public awareness You've got obviously the governor's comments, his last State of the State address. You've got the task force that Tom's going to talk about. 2 months ago, the President of the United States got on Air Force One, went to West Virginia, held a town hall. There's just a lot of discussion going on now, which again, needs to be translated into action, but I think it's certainly something to be proud of, and may already be making a difference. If you look at the data now, we are seeing some leveling of data that had been historically for years and years and years on a pretty steady trajectory, leveling out. Some painkiller sales and painkiller deaths now. We're starting to see plateau and maybe a sign of moving in the right direction. Again, a lot of work yet to go, but I want to emphasize that it's not all doom and gloom, and that there's definite progress being made. With that, I'll turn it over to Tom.
Good afternoon, everybody. Everybody hear me okay? It is truly a privilege to be here. I appreciate the invitation, and I also appreciate Dave allowing me to take some of his time. You'll notice my name is not in the biography section. I was a late add to this program, so I could share with you some of the task force information that the governor's task force just completed. Dave segued perfectly into my presentation. Everybody here kind of has their boots on the ground. This is a local environment, and there is evidently a tremendous amount of success in this room. There's recovering addicts, there's students that are teaching, there's people that are helping. So you all are invested, and you're not invested in some remote way. You're there and you're seeing it, or you are it. And so I think there's a fair question that you may ask yourselves now, or have asked yourself in the past: where are my state officials on this? Where is my federal government on this? When is this truly, truly going to come to the forefront? I know we talk about it and we hear about it, and people are saying things, but when are we going to see some true and some market action? And I think, and I truly believe that answer is now, and I think that that's starting. Prosecutor Jarzinka made a presentation to the task force that the governor initiated and the lieutenant governor championed for him. And he helped us to understand exactly what it is that's going on in this room. Made mention of this specific summit, which is why I was anxious to come here and see what it was all about. Unfortunately, I had a meeting this morning, but I came in and I was able to hear the end of Shannon, right? The end of Shannon's presentation, which is very impressive, and congratulations, by the way. And I was able to hear the students, who are also impressive, and what a cross-section. So that sees me, and it's great. So I come to this thing, and I learn too, and so I'm truly grateful for that. But when I talk about what is the state doing, what are your state officials looking to, I'd like to give you a couple of examples. What do we look to? Well, I'm from the Attorney General's office. Recently, my boss, Bill Schuette, afforded me the opportunity to go to New York for a national conference, a National Attorneys Association of Attorneys General conference in New York City at NYU Law School. Brought together a number of professionals, and I learned a tremendous amount of information about this very topic that I brought back and I'm trying to implement here in the state of Michigan with Dave's help and other individuals' help. But I give this example because a separate Attorney General's Association on that exact same weekend was having another conference on this exact same topic in Indianapolis. So more than half of the Attorney Generals in this country were talking about this very issue over the course of 3 days. And your Attorney General's office was at each of those conferences, had a voice, not a speaking role, but a voice, asked some very hard questions, and got to some issues that, even though the task force had been completed, both me in New York and my colleague in Indianapolis brought back things that, maybe that task force missed, and maybe there are some things that we can add to that. So that's what the Attorney General's office is doing. Talk about the governor's office. I was fortunate enough to be in a meeting just yesterday, 3 o'clock yesterday. I was in a meeting with the lieutenant governor of the state of Michigan, and there were a number of the department directors there. The Attorney General's office was there. And the purpose of that meeting was implementation of the report that the governor's task force put out at the end of October. Now, if you know anything about state government, when you have a task force, there's usually a little bit of a break after that task force puts its report out, and you kind of move on to the next thing and you see what's going on. The first thing that the Lieutenant Governor said in this meeting was, I think the report came out on October 26th. On October 29th, the governor of the state of Michigan asked the Lieutenant Governor, hey, how's the implementation of that task force report going? He's on top of that, and he wants that to happen, and the Attorney General's office is working towards making that happen. The department directors are making that happen, and all the way up to the top, the governor and the lieutenant governor are making that happen. There were 4 legislators that were on this task force. Each of those legislatures is either already has a draft, is drafting, or is seeking a draft of separate legislation in separate areas. So I'm aware of, I've reviewed a couple of separate bills that are making their way through the process now. I've talked to a couple of people who are looking at 2 others, and I was reviewing a spreadsheet last night after our meeting, and there's about 6 separate pieces of legislation that are at various parts in the process that are going to help this. And Dave's right. He mentions the Good Samaritan bill regarding seeking medical assistance for someone who's seeking an overdose. I agree with his sentiments. The bill that the governor may or may not sign, I don't know if he will, but assuming he does, is a good bill. It's a good piece of legislation. It takes us a step further in resolving this issue, this epidemic. But it can go further, and it should go further, and I'm hopeful that the legislators in the state can continue on that march so we can involve heroin, involve other illicit drugs, eliminate an age requirement, and get to perhaps a situation where there is protection for individuals who try to save other individuals who are in a real problem that may have affected your life in the past. So those are the things that are going. And then just this morning, ironically, because I was coming here, I stopped at a bagel store and I saw one of our local judges, and he said, what are you doing today? And I said, well, I'm going down to Jackson to speak at a drug summit. And he went on and on and on for 10 minutes longer than I had this morning to discuss the issue, about how important this issue is. So that's state government in the works. I don't know who else to cover. You have the governor, the lieutenant governor, the attorney general, 4 legislators, all 4 of whom were on the task force, all actively involved, actively doing something, not just standing at a lectern and saying, I think this is a good idea. Maybe someday at some point we should do something. They are doing something, and with the assistance of Prosecutor Jarzinka, other prosecutors throughout the state, Dave, other colleagues, and all of you, and others similarly situated, we can accomplish quite a lot, and as we all know, there is a lot to accomplish. The task force did come up with in excess of 20 recommendations, most of which, at least I think all of them, are very good and can take us a long way. And the lieutenant governor has voiced a preference for implementing, at least in some fashion, all of them within a year's time before the next state of the state is what I'm hopeful that he'll announce. So let me just start my presentation with that sort of lengthy introduction with what I do. I am involved in the professional licensing aspect. So where Dave does criminal work, I go after professional licenses as it relates to what we're all concerned about: bad acting dispensing pharmacists, bad acting doctors, and other people with prescriptive authority. So my client, if you will, would be the Michigan Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs, specifically the Bureau of Professional Licensing. So Licensing and Regulatory Affairs is one of the biggest agencies. I think it's the biggest agency in state government. I represent a particular portion of that, and that agency is responsible for sanctioning doctors, nurses, pharmacists, et cetera, that engage in behavior that violates the public health code. So this would include all professionals with prescriptive and dispensing authority. And sorry, unable to hear me. Am I stepping away too far? Laura also administers the MAPS program in the state of Michigan. So I work for the Michigan Department of the Attorney General, and my job is to represent Laura. And specifically, I'm in charge of the Attorney General's Licensing and Regulation Division, representing the Bureau of Health Professional Licensing. So the various responsibilities of each agency: Laura receives allegations of wrongdoing, investigates those allegations, handles less complicated administrative matters to completion, and works with the respective boards. So there's kind of three voices, if you will, in this process. You have the Attorney General's office in their legal role in representing LARA. You have LARA, or Licensing and Regulatory Affairs, that's responsible for the process portion of that and in charge of the licensing and regulation area. And then you have those, the respective boards that are all appointed by the governor of the state of Michigan that provide, if you will, the institutional expertise for their particular areas. So the Attorney General's office serves as general counsel to LARA and the boards, handles more complicated administrative matters to completion, attends administrative hearings and appeals, and staffs various board meetings. And then the board responsibilities, like I said, all gubernatorial appointees are responsible for reviewing allegations and authorizing investigations, adopting or rejecting proposals for decision following an administrative hearing. So you would, if somebody contests the fact that they violated the public health code, they'd be entitled to what's essentially a mini trial or an administrative hearing. And if the administrative law judge decided that they had in fact violated the code or did not violate the code, the board is ultimately the final arbiter or decider of whether they have in fact violated the code. And then the boards will be responsible for determining what appropriate sanctions are. So there can either be an agreement between my office or Licensing and Regulatory Affairs and an offending doctor, nurse, pharmacist, et cetera, and we can say, okay, your sanction should be you're suspended or you're put on probation so we can monitor you, or you're just going to be reprimanded and fined. Whatever that is, the board will ultimately be able to say, okay, we have the expertise, Attorney General, whomever, you don't have necessarily the expertise to know that, hey, this is actually really bad even though it doesn't seem really bad, so we're going to reject what you think is a fair settlement. Or maybe on the flip side, you're going too heavy, this may seem bad but isn't quite so bad. They can use that expertise to say, yes, we like this, or no, we don't. So they kind of have that final up or down vote in almost all circumstances. There are some finer points where they don't have quite as much of a voice, but it's rare. And then they serve as conferee or consultant in certain circumstances. So if I have a standard of care issue where, I'm not a doctor, I don't have any medical training whatsoever, so if there's something that's going on in a particular case that I don't necessarily understand, I can consult with them. The MAPS program is the second thing that I'll talk about, and I want to get to the recommendations, so I'll go through this relatively quickly. But essentially, the MAPS program is the Michigan Automated Prescription System. And it's an electronic database. Everybody hear me okay now that I take the microphone and put it in my hand? All right. It's an electronic database of Schedule 2, 3, and 4, and 5 controlled substances dispensed in the state of Michigan. So basically, generally, this applies to pharmacists. And when they dispense, they have to report to this system that they have, in fact, dispensed a controlled substance. That's the statutory section MCL 333.7333A. Is what governs, and then there's several administrative rules. So that allows Licensing and Regulatory Affairs to keep track of what is being dispensed throughout the state of Michigan. The database is maintained by the Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs, and it's provided by those who actually dispense the controlled substances. Prescription data is transmitted electronically through the state. So when you go to Myers or wherever you go and you fill your prescription and they're typing into the system there, one of the things that they're going to be doing is submitting the documentation about what's being dispensed into the MAPS program, and then they have to submit that program to the Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs on a daily basis. It used to be twice a month that they have to submit that information, which presented a problem because it opened up a significant window for doctor shoppers to kind of run around the state, get a whole bunch of prescriptions dispensed to them, and then only after the fact, when they're in their hands, do they get to the point where they could be caught after the damage has already been done. Reporting prescription information to MAPS is mandatory for dispensers, so the dispensers themselves are required to report this. The problem comes is that the prescribing physician is not required to consult MAPS before they actually write the prescription. And the individual who dispenses the controlled substance isn't required to consult that individual patient's MAPS report to see if they should be dispensing it. All they need to do is indicate that they have in fact dispensed it. So theoretically, somebody could go around and get various prescriptions, get 3 prescriptions for Vicodin in one day at an emergency room in Jackson County, emergency room in Ingham County, and their regular practitioner. They have 3. They can fill them at 3 separate pharmacies theoretically, and only after the fact will it be discovered that, hey, now all of a sudden they have all of this Vicodin when they shouldn't, and there's clearly an addiction issue there. And you're put in this position of trying to put the genie back in the bottle with somebody that can hurt themselves and is addicted, when if you have a proper flagging system and a proper consultation system, that could be caught beforehand, and the pharmacist can say, you know what, we're not going to fill this because you're either because you're filling more in an inappropriate period of time. And then you'll see the timing requirement. It's only been since July of 2014 that we have this daily reporting requirement. But for other reasons that I won't get into for time constraints, even the daily reporting requirement can cause some problems. And there's discussion that a real-time reporting requirement, so that it automatically goes into the system and is automatically submitted to the Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs, might be more appropriate. There's only one state in the country, Oklahoma, at least at last check, one state in the Union, Oklahoma, that had this capability, and it appears to work for them, but their logistics are a little bit different than a state of 10 million like us. Issues with MAPS. Lag time in data transmission to MAPS permits doctor shoppers to visit multiple doctors for similar prescriptions. MAPS technology is not easily integrated into prescribers' medical records, and cannot interface easily. So what does that mean? Doctors currently, they're not required to consult these MAPS programs, and frankly, when they're meeting with their patients, it could be a bit tenuous or difficult to consult them for every single patient that they're seeing. So if you have, forgive me, a lazy doctor, sorry for anybody who's in here, who just doesn't want to do this because they have to get to the next patient, they're not required to do so. So we need to get to a system where they're required to consult that MAPS report, and they can look and say, hey, this is when something was prescribed, and we need to look at this person a little more closely. Prescribers are not required to consult with MAPS, and then we have my friend David Tenai's here. A big issue is defining permissible and appropriate law enforcement access to MAPS, which, of course, we want to catch the bad actors. We want to make sure that law enforcement has the access that they need, but we also, from a legal perspective and perhaps a practical perspective too, want to be mindful of patient rights and patient privacy. So, the Michigan Prescription Drug and Opioid Abuse Task Force, commissioned by Governor Snyder in June of 2015, chaired by Lieutenant Governor Brian Calley, and was broken into 2 subcommittees: Regulation, Enforcement, and Policy, chaired by Attorney General Bill Schuette; Treatment, Prevention, and Outcomes, chaired by Director Nick Lyon of the Department of Health and Human Services. So those committees met separately. Without you holding me to it, I'll say they each met about 8 times. As you can probably guess when we're talking about this topic, there's a lot of overlap between the 2 subcommittees. As I indicated, Prosecutor Jarzinka presented to our committee Regulation, Enforcement, and Policy. I'm sorry, no, that was a full committee meeting, wasn't it? So that was the full committee met, the full task force met 4 times, I believe, and those were led by Lieutenant Governor Brian Calley. This is a list of all of the individuals that were actual task force members. And then we get right to the recommendations. And forgive me, for time reasons, I'll probably read and comment on just a very few of them. A lot of them are self-explanatory, and clearly this is a knowledgeable crowd about what we're talking about. I'm happy to field questions on them after we're done or at the question and the answer session. But I think it's important that you each have an opportunity to at least see and know what they are, because they're all listed here. And then there'll be a link to the actual report itself. It's an easy Google search too, so you could find the report. It's only about 30 pages long, so it's not that bad of a read, and it's quite informative. Number 1, requiring additional training for all professionals who will be prescribing controlled substances. 2, encouraging the development and maintenance of relationships among state and local agencies to provide necessary information regarding prescription drug abuse prevention and treatment. So just a collaborative effort between the federal government, the state government, local governments, and everybody that you would represent here in this local summit as well. Collaborations across agencies and the health professions to increase the availability of prescription drug drop-off bins, which is a significant issue. I believe it was the state of Wisconsin who made this example when I was in New York, but they did, they were doing, we should have drop-off bins that are just available all the time. But the big push is to have these quarterly pushes, if you will. And the state of Wisconsin, I want to say quarterly, it might have been every 6 months, did this major push, major public service announcements, you know, everything else to get the word out, to get these drugs off the street, out of the medicine cabinets and everything else. And they, and I don't have the actual numbers with me, but what they did their first drive and it was a successful one. Then they doubled it. The third time they did it, they doubled it again, and the fourth time they did it, I believe they quadrupled it. So, and that's after, you would think that there would be big numbers after that. So you would think the big numbers would be the first time, but that wasn't the case. So we're running short. I'll run through these last ones very quickly. Reviewing programs and parameters to determine the best route forward to eliminate doctor and pharmacy shopping, and there's a lot of legislative work that's being done on that already. So that seems very vague. But when you get in the weeds, there are some specifics that are being looked at on this doctor shopping issue. A multifaceted public awareness campaign to inform the public of the dangers of abuse, inform the public of how to safeguard or properly dispose of medicines, inform the public of how to recognize and publicize improper prescribing, and reduce the stigma of addiction, which is an important one. And here's just a few examples of some of the public service announcements that need to be out there. We see these on TV. That's a video that I'll pass through, but just that deals with an athlete who was injured, and we were talking about earlier, and ends up addicted to controlled substances after something was legitimately prescribed. The issue of naloxone, and we've touched on it. It's an important one. It saves lives, and it needs to be available for people to have it in emergency situations and know how to dispense it. Exploring Good Samaritan legislation, which we currently have. There's something that's on its way to the governor's office right now, and we'll see if he signs it. As David indicated, it could be expanded on, but it's a start, and I think that's important because we're seeing something. Increased access to care, including wraparound services and medication-assisted treatment. Dr. Waller, I know, talked about that earlier, and he could talk about medical-assisted treatment much better than I. Increasing the number of specialists practicing in the state of Michigan and expanding drug courts, required bona fide physician-patient relationships prior to prescribing controlled substances, and reviewing best practices and implement pilot programs for reducing the development of neonatal abstinence syndrome, which is important. Children, babies being born addicted to prescription drugs. Consider legislation to better define and identify pain management practices, and updating regulations to provide for a tiered licensing structure. I'm not sure if Dr. Waller talked about that or not, but that's one of his issues. Exemptions from civil liability for pharmacists who refuse to dispense something. So if a pharmacist refuses to dispense something now, they could be subject to civil liability. We want to get rid of that. Review the Michigan College of Emergency Physicians policy for appropriate and safe treatment and endorse a best practices model. Consider further limitations on the sale of pseudoephedrine, looking to the methamphetamine issue that we have in the state. Establish an ongoing commission that can pay attention to what's going on, and are the things that we're talking about here today actually being followed through on. And you hear the governor talk about the state dashboard. Add this to the state dashboard so we could look back, so you can look back, and we all can look back and say, are we having success or are we not? And where we aren't having success, what do we need to do? And what can we do to continue with the successes that we are having? Continuity of care where there's a medical practice that is closed abruptly. So if my department comes in and shuts down a medical practice because they are bad actors, what do we do with those patients who are addicted? We need to pay attention to that and be mindful of those individuals. And document law enforcement efforts with local coalitions. What local agencies is your local agency having success? If it is, how can we replicate it? Can we come in and steal all of those ideas and spread them around the state? Enhanced licensing sanctions, and then the MAPS program. And this is just I won't go all the way through it because I know I'm out of town, but the MAPS program, if we can't monitor what controlled substances are out there, who has them, and who the bad actors are, a lot of this conversation is for naught. We need to be able to identify who the bad actors are so that David can go out and discipline them appropriately or criminally prosecute them appropriately, and so that I can go out and take their licenses from them, so that the good actors who are prescribing these things for a proper and legitimate reason can continue to do what they need to do. So we need to find a balance to that approach so that we could get these folks off the street. So that is all I have. Sorry to read these things to you at the last moment, but I wanted to get through all of them so you at least saw them one time. Here's the link to the report, which I can provide to you. I'm happy to give my card to anybody who wants it, and you can email me, and I'll email you a copy of the report. Like I said, it's an easy read, but please look closely at the recommendations. And offices are available for comment or suggestions. This isn't the end of the road, and these aren't the only things that will solve this problem. And I know that the Governor's office, the Attorney General's offices, the various state departments, the prosecutor's office, all want to hear what ideas we have for those of you who are truly in the trenches on these issues. So thank you.